I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. I'm just doing a kind of a freestyle intro today on this special show. We're dropping an extra edition because of what is happening in the Middle East. And I have a very, very special guest. It's someone who is probably the only person of all the people I've looked at that I would want to interview at this point. His name is Aziz Abu Sarah. He is a Palestinian peace activist. He's in South Carolina, but he goes back and forth. Had a brother who was killed in the conflict, sort of, and has some very, very wise words. But aside from the wise words, he says some very, very interesting things about what it's like to be Palestinian. And those are things that are not being reported in the media. Like, for instance, and I didn't know this until I heard him say it in another interview the other day, most Gazans, and virtually almost all of the Gazans under the age of 20, have never met a Jewish person. Do you want me to repeat that for you? Most Gazans have never met a Jewish person. That is how separate the Jewish people of Israel and the Palestinians are, completely separate. And it may work the other way too, that not very many Jewish people have actually met too many Palestinians, Gazans in particular. So just hang on to that idea over the next days and weeks as all hell breaks loose and people begin to die in great numbers in Gaza, which, as the time ticks down, it seems very likely they will. They already have been. There's some terrible numbers coming out of there now. But understand that these are two peoples who don't know each other. So how can they coexist? Why are they so separate? So of course, when you don't know each other, you can hate each other. That's how these things work, isn't it? So that's just one of the things that Aziz Abu Sarah says. He completely obviously condemns what happened in Israel when these Hamas nutcase psychotics went in and committed terrible atrocities and murdered lots of good Israeli people and took hostages too, one of whom was a peace activist that Aziz knows quite well, this elderly lady. I believe she was on a kibbutz, who has been very, very active for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So he's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about who Hamas is and how they exist for the people of Gaza. What does the idea of human shields actually mean? It's a really interesting phrase because it is the phrase that everybody who wants this very kind of instantaneous and super violent response keep using to justify the killing of civilians in Gaza. And when I say that, I'm sure that my Jewish listeners may be saying, why is she caring about them? I care about them. I care as much about what happened in Israel. But now we're talking about something that maybe we have a chance to stop it. That's done. And killing a bunch of Palestinians in Gaza, civilians, is not going to change that. And in fact, it may make it worse in many, many ways. So as you hear me making this case, please do not think for a minute that I have not wept and grieved for the people who were killed in Israel in terrible ways. The fact that I reported as I did the beheaded baby story did not mean that I was denying the other atrocities that happened. We have to be able to look at facts and details through the lens of truth, pull it out from the propaganda, see how it's being used and what it means. And what the beheaded baby story meant, as I said in my note and in the Substack, is that was the phrase that was repeated and repeated over and over again by people who want to take the guardrails off of the Israeli response, meaning indiscriminate killing of civilians. Human shields is the other phrase, indiscriminate killing of civilians. And I think none of us want that to happen, right? None of us do. We're mad. We're mad. We want retribution. We want punishment. We want a punitive strike. But that's not always the best way. And don't we know that by now? Through all of human history, you know, these things just never work out, do they? And I think I feel like there's very few people left in the media and in government and in the diplomatic corps who are saying, can we take a breath here before we do something that is not only a war crime and inhumane, and yes, what happened in Israel was inhumane on steroids, but that it will make things worse for everybody in that region. And I mean that. It will make things worse for everybody in that region and around the world too, I think. And let me also kind of bookend my caveats by saying, again, to the Jewish people who listen to this show and who know me and my friends who are Jewish and my loved ones who are Jewish, it is a very scary time to be Jewish right now. These demonstrations in favor of Palestine and the Palestinians are coming at an absolutely stupid and, in my view, counterproductive time. This is not the right time to be doing it. I think if the bombardments go on, if civilian casualties in Gaza keep going and going and going, then there should be people in the streets about that. I would co-sign that. But right now it looks like the protesters are favoring, and in fact, some were, let's be honest, the violence that was perpetrated on innocent Israelis by Hamas nut jobs. That doesn't help anybody, and it scares Jewish people in ways they don't need to be scared again, especially in an era when our prime minister is applauding Nazis in the House. I know I said that before, but wow. I mean, imagine how that would feel if you were Jewish. It's like, okay, nothing's off the table now. We can cheer for Nazis in the House of Commons. We can cheer for atrocities against Jews in Israel by psychopaths. We can do it. Yeah. Okay. If you're Jewish and feeling vulnerable, you've got my total support and love, all of it. But we don't exist in a heroes and villains world. We cannot. Life is more complicated than that. And let me just add that I know that there, especially in London, that there have been some cases of Jewish people or people wearing little Israeli flags as a cape. Sometimes people do that at a demo. There are reports they've been chased and scared. That is like too historical. You know, people have to stop that. And that doesn't help. You got to knock it off. And so we're living in a very, very scary time right now. But it's in these times that we are called upon to dial up the angels of our better natures. The quick and easy and punitive, well, not easy, but punitive response is the one that feels good in the moment and the one that feels terrible 10 years later or even sometimes 10 days later. But the people who are saying what I'm saying are being ostracized and criticized and accused of terrible things. And that is also wrong. I should be able to speak for restraint and to safeguard the innocent Palestinians in Gaza without being accused of being an anti-Semite, which could not be further from the truth. So cut that out right now. I'm just dealing in facts. And if that's your view, if you're comfortable with innocent children, and by the way, like half the population of Gaza is young people, children, if you're happy with them being blown up, then you need to check your own moral compass. That's what I say about that. So this is our show today. Much easier to not weigh in. I'm still not feeling great, but whatever. It's an historic time. I'm not seeing a lot of people saying what we're feeling around here. So I felt I had to climb out of bed and do a show. So that's what I'm doing. I did cover 9/11. I mean, the post 9/11 world. I wrote a book with some of the soldiers and Marines who served in Iraq after 9/11. And a lot of what's being said and done right now in the aftermath of what happened in Israel feels a lot like that. And let's not forget that people who were not in favor of what ended up being a misbegotten war campaign in Iraq, the people who were for it were very, very critical of people who were encouraging temperance and thought, like Scott Ritter and others, myself included. I was protesting that war, even though I had deep, deep sympathy and felt horror for what happened on 9/11 at the World Trade Center towers. But I didn't think going after Iraq in the way America was going after it on the false casus belli of weapons of mass destruction was the right answer. And in fact, it wasn't. 1 million dead. Abu Ghraib, let's not forget that. And the creation of ISIS. None of those things would have happened if America hadn't gone into Iraq. So we need to remember where this need for vengeance and punishment can take us. You know, the guys who were Charles Grainer and the people who were running the torture rooms at Abu Ghraib, Charles Grainer was one of them and went to jail for it, would also say that what they were doing was in order to keep America safe and the troops safe from the insurgency that had grown up after America had successfully invaded Iraq and then completely botched the aftermath. And no smart person will disagree with that. It was a disaster. And what they did post kind of military victory is what helped create the insurgency there. And that's the absolute truth. I interviewed a guy named Colonel King, who was kind of charged with helping to build Baghdad. Also a young guy named I think it was Jonathan Powers, a captain in the army who was tasked with helping to rebuild Baghdad. It's like 22-year-old, 23-year-old army captain. What? You know, and they couldn't keep the sewage off the streets. They couldn't make the city run. They went from playing soccer in the backyards with Iraqi families who actually had welcomed many of them as liberators from under Saddam Hussein. And after, about a year of disastrous running of the country by the fools in the green zone, and the kids charged with doing the civil expediting, an insurgency grew. And the insurgency grew also because they foolishly sent Saddam's own militia off. They let them go. And where did they go? They went to Fallujah. They marinated up there in anti-Americanism. And the next thing you know, you've got 3 or 4 contractors hanging from the bridge outside Fallujah, burned to a crisp and dead. And that's kind of when the insurgency really took off. But it didn't have to be that way. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It didn't have to be that way. It was America's response to some degree that got that thing going. And any high-level American military analyst will tell you that. That's what happened. So the people who were running the torture rooms in Abu Ghraib, which was exposed by Seymour Hersh, who's been on this show, would also say that they were keeping Americans safe from the bad people, from the terrorists, right? So what I'm trying to say to you is that We can't sink to their level. We can't be doing what they're doing. We're not them. And as mad as we get, and we're all pretty mad, it's better to take stock, run it through our spiritual meters, and figure out what the best response is going to be. So here's why I'm so rattled, because people that I admire and look up to in this kind of movement we have of free speechers and anti-regime change war types and anti-COVIDian tyranny and anti-extreme, anti-racist craziness. We share all of these things, a whole bunch of us, Dave Rubin and Douglas Murray. Lots of us do. People I admire. And I will tell you something, they have gone right into the tank for Israel in this war. Take off the guardrails, go do it, clean them out. They're animals. What are you talking about proportionality? What does that even mean? I mean, Douglas Murray said that. One of the finest minds, I think, making public statements on anything today except this. He's wrong. And he's like Christopher Hitchens in the sense that he sounds really smart while he's being wrong, but he's wrong. And I'll tell you why I can say that, because when 9/11 happened, I was approached to think about writing a column. This was maybe 1 or 2 days after it had happened. And I said to the newspaper, well, I'm not going to write anything. I'm too freaked out. I don't know what to make of it. I want to see what Christopher Hitchens is thinking before I weigh in. I was too scared and not smart enough to know what to do. So I waited, and then there it was. Chris was out for blood in a way that really freaked me out. And I thought, well, okay, so this guy, I'll always love him. And later on, he was great again. But around the Iraq War, he was blinded and he was wrong. He was dead wrong. Not just there were no WMDs, but the strategy was an absolute failure. So I feel like that's happening to me again, that the people who should be taking a minute, take a pause before you write the really mean email to your boss because of some slight. Take a pause before you hit the send button, because you'll probably blow up your career. You know, a good friend says just the 24, 48-hour rule, you know, before you hit send. And I'm making light of it a bit, but isn't foreign policy a place where we should really be doing that when there's so much at stake for everybody? You know, theoretically, there should be punishment, but the only people who should be punished are the ones who did it. And I think we've forgotten that. And I'm very upset that people I admire, Ben Shapiro has gone nuts. Now, I wouldn't say I'm a huge admirer of Ben Shapiro I don't think he's thoughtful. I think he's smart, and I think he's erudite. He's well-educated, but I don't always agree with him, although I could admire him. But he has gone right into the tank. Like, he is actually on the brink of counseling war crimes. I don't know, maybe a JAG lawyer, a military lawyer will say he is counseling war crimes. But he put out a video yesterday, and I thought to myself, like, does anybody love this guy? Does he have a wife or a friend who might say, Ben, step away from the keyboard for a minute and take a beat? Because it's awful. I mean, it actually reveals something about him. One of the things it reveals is that he's deeply, deeply Zionistic and deeply, deeply pro-Israeli. That's cool. That is fine. But you're a commentator, kind of, and you should be able to run some neutrality through your thinking process right now. But he is lost to us. It's unbelievable. And there are other people too, but I'm not going to name them because I hope that we can be friends again one day. But I would say probably 15 high-profile people have really let me down. And here's the interesting thing about it. You can think about this. many of them were pro-vaccine and really mean about anti-vaxxers for a while. And then all of a sudden they figured it out. They switched sides, which I cheer for. Sign of an agile mind if you can change your opinion based on new data, right? But almost to a man in this group I'm talking about, they were really, really late to the COVID party, really late to the vaccine party, and punitive toward anti-vaxxers. Piers Morgan is another one, but we know that about him. That's just who he is. And frankly, Piers ain't that bright. He's revealed that about himself. So I'm mourning a lot of things right now. And probably at the bottom of that well, I am insecure also about my own judgment. When that many people who I admire as smart, critical thinkers are on the other side of an issue from me, only an idiot doesn't review their own thinking, which I've been doing. And I don't think I'm wrong. I think in 2 months from now, like after the Iraq war and lots of other things, that I was on kind of the wrong side, thought I was on the wrong side of history. But I don't think I am wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, because I cannot see how an aggressive Israeli military response that isn't just about catching the bad guys is going to do anything but make things worse. Maybe a few people will feel better, but it's just going to make things worse. And revealing that people smarter than me haven't been able to figure that out is pretty scary. Maybe it's because they were always conservative and I was actually, I was kind of a traditional liberal who then got mad at liberalism and I don't know. There's probably a book to be written about what's happened in the last week, right? So much. So I know we're all struggling. I know you're here because you trust me. I will tell you, I'm struggling. I don't know everything. I've been to Israel. I'm going to do a show on my experience in Israel and the West Bank. All I will say is that I do think the Palestinians have a shitty deal. I saw it with my own two eyes. However, I understand why Israel is frightened and sometimes behaves the way it does. I get that too. That's all I'm going to say for now. But who do we look to? And then I also know some people who are smart who aren't saying very much at all right now, because this is such an overheated environment that this is more dangerous than speaking out about COVID, given the level of enmity for people who are asking for a moment to consider less carnage, please. Anyway, so my guest, Aziz Abu Sarah, Palestinian peace activist, he will probably make you think differently about what's going on there. He's not on the show to apologize or to explain. I wanted him here because I heard him on another show, and he was really smart at explaining how the Palestinians in Gaza live, how he perceives things, how he's been able to kind of be friends with people on both sides in a deep and abiding way in the midst of all of this conflict. And that one little detail that he says, which is that very few people in Gaza have ever met a Jewish person. I mean, they're 2 feet away, but they don't leave, right? They don't leave the compound they're in. They don't, so they don't know them. So of course they don't like each other. And same with Israel. How many Israelis have met Gazans? Not very many. So one wonders if that isn't somehow a deliberate way to keep them fighting, but that's also for another day. So I do want you to think about Abu Ghraib and what happened and why it happened. I also want you to think about My Lai, because the My Lai massacre, which was Also reported by Cy Hirsch. Wow, he did Abu Ghraib. He exposed Abu Ghraib and he exposed the Meli Massacre in Vietnam. This guy is, and now he's writing on Substack. Nuts. He's just written a brilliant piece about this story too, saying that that Bibi Netanyahu had actually fostered Hamas because he wanted to keep the tension going because it was good for him politically. Woof. And that's kind of proven. There's documents out now that show that that's true. And also that in order to facilitate a party by settlers who are aggressively anti-Palestinian and grabbing these little hunks of land away, he sent two, I don't know what the word is. They weren't battalions. That's like probably too many, but two large groups of IDF soldiers to protect some settlers who were having a big party, religious party, up in the north, leaving the southern border with Gaza with only one of these groups of soldiers, which was way not enough to keep it secure. So that was why did he do that? That's a pretty big screw up too, right? So I'm not saying, oh, it doesn't matter that it happened because it was Bibi's fault. I'm not saying that was terrible. I'm condemning the people who did it. But why did all these things go wrong? Why did he do that? There were also apparently 2 or 3 warnings from Egypt, also very strange that they weren't listened to. One theory is that there was some intention to let it happen, but they didn't know how bad it was going to be. They thought it was going to be a couple of rockets. Bibi was in political trouble, and that a couple of rockets being fired in, always people gather around, your leader when there's aggression. So that also has some credibility, but it's too horrifying to think about, isn't it? And of course, we're still dealing with the idea that it was funded in part by America, who give money to Iran at the drop of a hat. And they're not being called out to account, are they? Isn't it interesting that Netanyahu doesn't seem to be mad at Biden or Blinken for funding it? Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because a deal was struck? Yeah. And the other thing, just before we go, do look at some of the language being used. I'm always following propaganda. And so the phrase, I support Israel's right to defend itself, is the answer that people, leaders of all stripes in all Western countries, same line. It's like safe and effective, safe and effective. It's a line they use to justify what they know will be the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza. I support Israel's right to defend itself. That's what they say. And that's what you'll be hearing a lot of when the bad stuff starts going down. So here is my interview with Aziz Abu Sarah, a Palestinian peace activist who owns a company called Mesdi Travel. And it's a travel company based on helping Palestinians and Israelis actually get to know each other so that they can start working towards something beyond this hellish, absolutely hellish world that is the, Israel, West Bank, Gaza right now. Here's my interview with Aziz. Hi, Aziz. How are you?
Not okay, but I think very few people are these days.
And where are you, if you don't mind my asking? Which part of the world?
I am in the U.S. right now. However, I was in Jerusalem just about 2 weeks ago. I divide my time between the United States and Jerusalem.
Yeah. And let me just ask you personally how you're holding up, because look, I have no skin in this game and I'm completely freaked out. So for someone like you who has friends on both sides and you know the situation so intimately, how are you holding up?
Yeah, I think the normal loyalties some people in these days having to either side just doesn't work for me because I have friends, as you mentioned, on both sides, and I've have friends who's been hurt on both sides, people who's been killed, people who's been injured, families of friends of friends. Everyone I know is suffering from the Israeli side. I know few people who's been directly affected, somebody who's missing, who I've worked with in peace building, Vivian Silver, others who's been as well hurt. And so many of my friends have lost family members. I can't even count another peacemaker, Muhammad Darawshe, whose son was killed. He was a medic in Israel and was trying to help people when he was shot. And then on the Palestinian side, I mean, I have friends who lost family members already in Gaza, and my families, my parents, next door neighbor, basically was shot, 15 years old, in his head in Jerusalem. So it's just the stories of bereavement, the stories of sufferings. Every day I wake up terrified of what the news I'm going to get today and who's next. And this a list that seems to never end of people who keep getting killed. And it's all innocent people. It's all the good people that are paying the price of the madness of our leaders.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I'm old enough to remember well 9/11 and what happened after 9/11, and the way people were kind of divided up, and the way people that I respected very much seemed to have lost their minds. And I feel that this is like that, but on steroids. Like what's happening on social media right now is, I mean, it is actually psychotic. It is insane. And I feel that maybe we've been divided up anyway, more so by social media and our consuming of media anyway. But what's going on right now, it actually feels worse and more scary and more divided than after 9/11. Do you agree?
Oh, I think you're right. And if you're talking about the United States, especially, absolutely. I think people see it. You can only sympathize with one of the two. I saw somebody posting, if I tell people that I'm outraged at the murder and killing of children, they first have to know which children we're talking about before I can be upset or justify it. And that feels so true, that we're okay with killing children as long as it's not the side we decided are good. And it's really mind-boggling. But also the messaging coming from our politicians reminds me a lot of after 9/11. It's when you make decisions based on fear, based on anger, based on hatred. And we know where those decisions led us. You know, a war in Afghanistan that eventually led to so many losses of life, and we handed Afghanistan back to Taliban. A war in Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, that led to nothing. None of the promises we were given about how we're going to transform these countries and we're going to end terrorism and it's going to end oppression. None of that happened. And that's why when I listen to promises today from leaders, just let Israel do what it has to do and they will wipe out Hamas and Gaza is going to become a paradise and it's going to be, people are going to be so happy. And I'm like, looking at how it went in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, we really have no good track record in wars and in turning things into paradise, at least not in the last 20 some years.
It's interesting you would say that, because I did a book about the Iraq War with the many of the soldiers and Marines who served there, completely a kind of an oral history from their perspective. And the thing that I learned about it is about the idea of these kind of so-called regime change wars, that the Americans actually won Iraq in the first month, the run up to Baghdad, everybody, they won. And then, right. And then I interviewed a guy named Colonel King, very interesting guy, devout Christian, who was who was standing around in Baghdad and handed like a binder and said, okay, well, you're running Iraq now. Like this is right. And these kids who had various sectors of Baghdad, and, they let Saddam Hussein's guards go, and they went to Fallujah and got all, it was a mess, because you cannot impose, we're going to impose capitalism on, and it was just a disaster. And, I feel, Aziz, like we learn nothing.
Yeah, and you have calls today. I'm in South Carolina. My senator is Lindsey Graham.
Oh, lucky you.
I know. And I was watching a video of him talking about how this is a U.S. war, which it is not, and how we should bomb Iran, which we absolutely shouldn't. And these drums of wars, and people so excited about leaders being so excited. And if people don't really, if we're not careful, and if we let emotions, and I know people are angry, and the images coming out of Gaza and the images coming out of south of Israel are horrific. But if we lead with emotions and not think about the consequences of the decisions we making today, we're going to have millions of people suffer, and things will get worse, just like it is worse in Iraq today than it was 20 years ago. It is worse in Syria today than it was 15 years ago. It is worse in Afghanistan than it was when we went there. That's a reality. These are facts, that things have not improved when we went to wars to change regimes. It just has not worked.
And yet Tulsi Gabbard, who was a hero of mine, is now on the side of, we got to go in there and get them. And she there's no one's urging restraint or thoughtfulness or consideration. They've all of these people I admired this is exactly what happened in 9/11 too. Remember, Christopher Hitchens went crazy. And I'd been a fan of his writing, and it seems like something happens maybe when it's a certain kind of atrocity or a certain level of loss of life, or the horrors of the video are so kind of inhumane that they take over the frontal cortex. I don't know what happens to people, but they're and it's a question for you, actually. I'll stop talking because I want to hear from you. But that is this level of response kind of expected given what happened in Israel? Is there another way for people to react when what we're seeing is so grim? How do we deal with that as a society and as a world?
Yeah, I think we should be allowed to be angry. We should be allowed to grieve. This is absolutely a time to be angry, to grieve. But I think the decisions shouldn't be made because of that grief and anger. And we have to always look at what led us to where we are today. How did we get here? Because if we want to change the reality, and we want to make sure something like this doesn't happen, you want to weaken an organization like Hamas, and you want to stop these kind of murders, you have to look at how they got powerful. You have to look at how do you give people vision? How do you give people hope? How do you strengthen people who are pro-peace? We have not done that. So we are outraged today at what Hamas did. We outraged today at what Israel is doing. But we are too late for that outrage. Yeah. We should have been outraged, and I can give you a few points of history. We should have been outraged back in the early 2000s when Hamas took over Gaza and had a civil war against other Palestinians. We should have been outraged when Netanyahu became prime minister and made it his policy to strengthen Hamas. This is, again, unfortunately, a proven fact that he said on more than one occasion that his policy is to strengthen Hamas financially, militarily, so it can stop a peace settlement of two-state solution. That was his policy. We were okay with it. We were okay with daily acts of violence in our streets, whether by Palestinians or by Israelis. We were okay with pogroms that the Israeli settlers carried in the last year and a half in an increased fashion in the West Bank. We were okay with racism, people in governments coming out and saying stuff like we should wipe out a whole village or a whole city. We're okay with corruption on the Palestinian side, giving money to people to oppress Palestinian voices and not allow any challenge of younger people to the Asian government. These things, we were all okay with it. And then we are surprised that something like what happened. If you have a friend of mine yesterday was telling me it's like a pressure cooker. You can't have this reality of a continuous occupation. You cannot have this reality of corruption. You cannot have this reality of leaders who incite for hatred. You cannot have this reality of teaching for hatred and then be surprised when this happens. We should have been working, all of us, Israelis, Palestinians, international community, should have been working to make a difference when things were a bit more calm. Now, it feels to a lot of people it's only war the solution. War will not make a difference. What needs to happen is exactly what we should have done years ago, is try to come to an end and a settlement to this conflict. A holistic approach, not just with Palestinians, Israel and the Arab world. That's what needs to happen. A real negotiation, a sitting down and saying, how do we finish this thing once and for all? And no one's interested in doing that because the status quo is unfortunately still too good, is so good for so many people, is helpful for many politicians.
And a lot of these old Palestinian leaders too, actually, if I'm reading you correctly, don't actually care about the people. They're sitting around getting rich and serving their own self-interest. I want to just ask you a question about something you said, because that's a very...
Can I comment on that? Because I think that's
please.
Important. Talking about Palestinian leadership is really important. And I get that question a lot. One is, well, people voted for Hamas, therefore they deserve what's happening for them. And you guys voted for Abu Mazen in the West Bank, and you're not challenging him. And where are the young leaders? And all these questions. And the good questions. But first, Hamas was voted 17 years ago, and it didn't even win the majority of the votes. It was the plurality of the votes. It wasn't the vast majority of people. But more importantly, most Palestinians alive today did not vote in any elections in their lives. Palestinians who have tried to challenge these corrupt leaders in the West Bank or in Gaza found themselves in prison, sometimes Palestinian prisons, sometimes Israeli prisons, because it was also the interest of Israel to continue. Corrupt leaders are easier to deal with, easier to continue the occupation with. And so you ended up in prison when people, I've made some challenges myself to the current leadership, Palestinian leadership, and I couldn't get not a one international body, not the US, I'm a US citizen, not the US, not Europe, not nobody. When I was getting death threats, as I was doing civilian way of challenging, calling for elections, trying to get Palestinians more involved, I could not get the support of a single international body. And then those are the same people who coming today and saying, why aren't you challenging your leadership? Well, you were giving money, power, weapons to that leadership, saying it's okay if they arrest us. And then now you're coming to challenge me and say why you haven't done it. This is absurd. It makes me so furious because I was very outspoken. 2018, I launched a political campaign. I was very, very outspoken, and I couldn't get a single support.
And that's very interesting because I just want to hit you with some of the things that people are saying to justify this kind of scorched earth event that may happen in Gaza in any minute now. Let's see, what time is it? It's 10:19 Eastern time on Monday. So anything could happen between now and the time you hear this. But part of it is, the Palestinian people deserve what they get because they voted for Hamas. So they're in on it. They deserve a harsh response because they're as bad as the people who did what they did, the atrocities in Israel. What is your response to that?
Look, one is the people in Gaza did not vote for Hamas because there hasn't been an election, like I said, in 17 years. So that argument is nonsense. Majority of people in Gaza are actually under the age of 18 years old. Vast majority of people are under 35, I think over 75% or so. So if it comes to voting, we didn't. But here's the thing. Majority of people in America, you could argue, have voted for Bush. that doesn't make Americans a target of Iraqis because you voted for Bush. Majority of people in Israel have voted for Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, who had policies that are racist and for occupation and have killed Palestinians. I don't think it justifies and it's okay to kill Israeli civilians because of who they voted for. We cannot justify killing civilians because of who they voted for, even if they have. And in the case of Gaza, they definitely have not. That did not happen. But justifying killing civilians based on their voting record is really a dangerous thing, because we're basically saying terror attacks are okay if we do that. And they're not. You can't say terror attacks against people who voted for a government that has done whatever it has done is okay because of a policy, because of a violence, because of Hamas is not a democracy. Hamas is authoritarian. If you object to its rule, you end up in prison. Many people have been. So you can't really look at people in Gaza and say, oh, you should have done better. These are people who barely have more than, usually without the war, between 4 to 6 hours of electricity. They don't have water that is actually useful for drinking. They have major shortage of clean water. They don't have a place to go. They can't leave it through Israel. They can't go through Egypt. And then we're telling them, with all the suffering you have, you should have been mostly worried about how to get rid of Hamas. It's not that simple.
Yeah. I think people don't understand that they can't be out in front of whatever the Hamas headquarters in Gaza City is with signs and chanting. Like, that just doesn't happen there, right?
Yeah, it doesn't happen. And yet people have tried. I have friends who've been in Hamas prisons, but they got very little support. Hamas has become it started very unpopular, by the way, in Gaza. When they took over Gaza, they were very, very unpopular. And they became more and more popular the more Israel tightened its siege with Egypt on Gaza, where medicine, food, things like that became harder and harder to get. And then with the first round of bombings and war between Hamas and Gaza, it started getting more popular, because in people's psyche, even if me and you don't get along at all, if somebody bombs the United States today, we're going to feel we have to stick together. If somebody is coming after us, even if we hate each other, it becomes a time of being unified. It becomes a time of being grateful that you may be defending me. And that's how people in Gaza ended up seeing it. The only people who are in power were Hamas. We being punished by Israel and by Egypt, so we stick together. And it made Hamas more popular. And the policy, which also was the same, by the way, in Iraq and is the same in Iran, the policy of let's starve the people in Gaza so they know that Hamas is bad, ended up making Hamas 10 times more popular than it was.
Yeah. Bad move. Okay, I want to I'm going to play this clip of David Levy, who a former Israeli peace negotiator who appeared on BBC and really took offense at one of the kind of canned questions that journalists are asking these days. And we will do that. But I just want to ask you something, and I want to phrase it exactly correctly. But the kind of wholesale pushback against the people in Gaza right now, the support for an extreme military action of some sort that may even wipe it out at the end of the day. The kind of the bottom line argument is this: these people hate Israel. They want Israel gone. They're anti-Semitic. They hate the Jews, and they will forever, as long as there is civilization, be trying to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And if we remember the Holocaust, then we must always stand with Israel when faced with this threat. That is the underpinning argument when you work through all the other stuff. What do you say to that, Aziz?
You remind me of a poem by Mahmoud Darwish. And in it, he talked about being accused of hating Jews. And I love that poem because it kind of touches on what you just said. Let me see if I can bring it up. It says, accusation is that I hate Jews. Accusation in Gaza is that people hate Jews, and
Israel. Yeah.
Right. And I don't think it is necessarily true, but in the poem he says, it's not comfortable that they show me as a devil and an enemy of Israel. I'm not a lover of Israel, of course. I have no reason to be, but I don't hate Jews. And then he goes, I will continue to humanize even the enemy. The first teacher who taught me Hebrew was a Jew. The first love affair in my life was with a Jewish girl. The first judge who sent me to prison was a Jewish woman. So from the beginning, I didn't see Jews as devils or angels, but as human beings. And I think it kind of works both ways here. Do people in Gaza are furious at Israel? Yes. Do they see Israel as taking away their freedom? Absolutely. But being against the government of Israel's policies is hating all Jews is absolutely wrong. Want to erase Israel. Nobody knows what the people in Gaza really think. They don't have hope right now. And when people don't have hope, they lose vision. If you asked Palestinians and Israelis in 1992 your view of the other, you would have got majority, and actually there are polls that tells us majority were no peace is possible, hate them, we cannot talk to them, period. That was the majority of voices. Based on that, we could have said, well, there's nothing to do. A year later, there was a peace agreement. That peace agreement failed. But in that peace agreement, when you ask Palestinians and Israelis right after, what's your view of the other? Suddenly, because they saw vision, they saw hope, they changed. It became majority of people for the agreement. That's what we have today. Yes, if you go and ask people in Gaza right now, as they're being bombed, do you love Israel? They're going to tell you no. But this is not the right time to ask them. Just like if you go to Israel right now and ask, majority of people are angry. They're going to tell you no. We don't care even about Gaza. But this is not the right time to ask. We can't again, because people are full of emotions right now. If we create a path forward that people can see hope, that can change. People looking at Gaza and saying, like here, Mahmoud Darwish saying, like, oh, they are devil, painting them as the devil, as, oh, they are the enemy of Israel. That's how you dehumanize people and think it's okay to kill everybody. It's okay for me to not feel pain when civilians are killed. I refuse that. And just like Mahmoud Darwish said, I refuse it toward the people in Gaza. I also refuse to feel that way toward Israelis and toward Jews. I've had both of our communities have good people, and they have people who sent some to prison, who have killed, but we also have people, like he said, his first Hebrew teacher was a Jew. That's true for me as well. They're not devils and they're not angels. They're human beings, and the human beings do good and do bad.
Yeah. So we do seem to be and I really want to get your response to this, these outpourings of support for the Palestinians, which is kind of a new thing in my lifetime. Wow. There's like huge crowds coming out to support them. And oddly, I'm not sure it's working in the way it's supposed to, because people are now thinking that the people who support Palestine in these demos, and I think a lot of the kids who are doing the supporting of Palestine maybe don't even really understand the issues. It's just trendy right now. And I'm sure the Palestinian people are saying, well, I'll take it if I can get it, right? Who cares if they really fully understand? But it looks like they are celebrating the atrocities from, right? And so I said in a piece I wrote for Substack, it's great for people to finally discuss in a meeting or try to put on the table some of the problems Palestinians have. But this is not, it's almost like it's not the right time. You can't be cheering when they're still finding dead bodies in the kibbutz. Like it's just, right? What was your response to that?
Absolutely. I think you have to differentiate between supporting Palestine and supporting Hamas, and these are not the same thing. If you're supporting Palestinians, supporting freedom, you're welcome. If you're supporting killing Jews, then I don't want you in our movement. I don't think Jews are responsible, like I said earlier, for the actions of the state of Israel, not in Israel and not around the world. I don't buy this argument every Jew must and is responsible for what Israel does and to justify hating Jews. But I think also we kind of, because of our conflict, sometimes we do attract people who do hate Jewish people and use our cause for their benefits. I see vice versa as well. I see people who hate Muslims who become very pro-Israel, but not because they care about Israel, but because they hate Muslims.
Yep.
But I remember more than one occasion, I would meet somebody and they'll ask, where are you from? And I'll say, Palestine. And they literally would look at you and say, yeah, I hate those effing Jews too. And I'm like, wait. I didn't say I hate Jews. I just said I'm from Palestine. And the assumption is for them, if you're Palestinian, you must be hating Jews. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. You mixing those things. Palestinian movement asking for freedom, asking for ending the occupation is not and should never be based on hating Jews or even Israelis. It's based on on a human right. It's based on freedom. It's based on goodness, not based on hate. And if we make our movement based on hate, we lost already. That is not what we should do. So when I see these people out in the streets, people who celebrating death of civilians, that's not in my name. That is not in the name of Palestinian freedom. That is something we definitely don't want to embrace. But when I see people out in the streets asking to end of violence and asking to end of the bombing in Gaza, I think that's different. And those people absolutely get my support. In New York, there were, I think, over 1,000 Jews out 2 days ago protesting, asking for ending the war. That's my tribe. They Jewish, but we on the same side for justice and peace. To me, these are my brothers and sisters. We fight on the same side of not wanting not Jews and not Palestinians, not Muslims, nobody to be hurt.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, because it's a kind of a troublesome thing to watch. There have been incidents, I know, in London and other places where terrible things were being said. I think a Jewish person wearing an Israeli flag was chased down the street, and so it's such a disaster on so many levels for people to be able to kind of talk over what's happening. Okay, you got to go in half an hour, so I'm going to keep going. I could keep you here all day, but I know you've got other stuff to do. Okay, so Dave, is it pronounced Levy? Daniel Levy? Daniel Levy. So he's a former Israeli peace negotiator, appeared on BBC, who are using their usual talking points. And he wasn't having it. And I thought it was a really, really interesting response from him. So here he is, Aziz, and we'll talk about that when we come back in a minute.
The Israelis would say, well, look, we are defending ourselves. We are targeting Hamas targets in Gaza. We are trying to put an end to what we believe is a terrorist organization once and for all.
Do you really keep a straight face when you say that? Do you think terrorist organizations embedded in populations who are denied their most basic rights are ended once and for all in a military campaign? Does that happen in history? Can someone credibly tell me that when the leadership of a country says we are cutting off food, electricity, water, all supplies to an entire civilian population, that they're targeting militants? I'm sorry, these kind of lies can't be allowed to pass. And when you tell yourself the lie, it leads to the wrong policy. If anyone told me that what the militants did on the weekend was a legitimate response to years and years of occupation, I would say, no, you're wrong-headed. You've lost sight of humanity and reality. And if anyone tells me that what Israel is doing in Gaza today is a legitimate response to what happened on the weekend. It's exactly the same.
And yet they are saying it, and yet the international community is saying that.
And people need to challenge them on it because it's a lie, and we're warmongering if we allow them to get away with it.
What do you think of that?
Oh, I agree. I agree. And everything Daniel is, I think it, I'm listening and I'm smiling because it's so normal what he's saying. It's so reasonable. It sounds 100% the right thing. And yet so many people can't comprehend it. I liked how he started. Can you say this even in a straight face? That, oh, we can justify whatever we want because of what you did. This argument, like the reason there is laws of war is to be used when there is war, not to use it only when it's peace. Like, what's the point of an international law? What's the point of rules of law? If we're not going to use them in times of war, then when are they going to be used? This is, I think, that one of the things that has been most frustrating for me listening to different governments speaking, from Germany to the EU Commission to the US, when they're being asked simple questions. Should Israel abide by rules of war, by the Geneva Convention? And they couldn't say yes. And that's terrifying. They kept saying, we stand with Israel. Like, wow, you can't even say, hey, you don't want to call to the end of the war? Fine. At least say we want to preserve civilians' life. At least do it as a lip service, even if you don't mean it. And they couldn't even do that, which to me shows, and I hate to say it that way, but our lives don't matter. Yeah. Palestinian lives are cheap for these people. And they think civilians, they actually agree that civilians in Gaza are okay to be sacrificed for a greater good in their mind. And it's insane. That's why I think that what Daniel Levy said is absolutely right. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think the talking point there that they're using, that you're referring to, is, I support Israel's right to defend itself. That's what they say. That's the talking point when you ask about civilians, right?
But you can't say also that you want Israel to abide by rules of, like, they couldn't. I watched this one conversation with a few government officials from Germany, and they were asked 6 times to just say, can you say you also want Israel to abide by rules of war? And they kept saying exactly the word you said. I stand by Israel and its right to defend itself, period. And I couldn't understand, what does that mean?
Yeah. It's almost like a memo went out. I mean, a memo did go out. Obviously, Western leaders have had a briefing to say this as their talking point when asked that question. And that's very, very scary to me. I want to ask you, I just want to go back to something you said, especially in light of what Daniel Levy said, just to be clear. He said, in essence, that the response to occupation that happened in Israel with the atrocities, etc., is not a response we should support, nor is the kind of invasion that they're doing. Is both things. Now, earlier you said, and I just want some clarity here, that that living that way in Gaza, there's been some disputes about how bad it is, but the fact of the matter is it's pretty bad. Anybody who knows anything about that area knows it's bad, and we can get into that in a minute. But you suggested that living that way can breed this. And so I don't want that to be misinterpreted, right? I don't want people to think that you're saying that Absolutely this is responsible. So, because I heard you in another interview put it differently, and I know what you think. So let's just clean that up before we move on. Yeah.
You are absolutely right. I don't think there is any justification for what happened in Israel. And I think for killing people, killing civilians, going into neighborhoods, killing kind of people in their homes, children. It's like I said, I have friends who've been affected by that, friends who've been killed, friends who've been friends of friends, families of friends. So there is no justification whatsoever. I think what's happening in Gaza is tragedy in the sense of the life there. And I think we should do everything we can to end the occupation, but not through violence. I believe nonviolence is the way forward. I also have been, for as long as I can remember, an outspoken against Hamas rule. I think an Islamist organization that does not believe in in any democratic understandings, does not accept any dissent, is not an organization I want, a government I want in charge of a future free Palestine. I think that's where I stand. I think there is nothing that justifies violence, and that's why I agree fully with Daniel Levy. I think we think, I like to think of it a bit different even. Look, my brother was killed in the first Intifada. I understand the rage of wanting revenge. I understand the urges of wanting revenge. I understand it from Palestinians. I understand it from Israelis. But I don't condone it. Understand how people got there is important because I've been there. Condoning it and accepting that this is a reality is the problem we live in. Accepting that it's the only response we can have to the occupation is to kill. No, it's not. It's not the only response. Just like I don't think the only response to what Hamas did is to bomb Gaza. I'm reminded by another poem, if you're okay with it.
Sure.
And it's by Samih al-Qasim, who said, "The day I'm killed, my killer will find travel tickets in my pocket. One to peace, one to fields and rain, and one to the conscience of a humankind. I beg you, do not stay and waste them. Killer of mine, I beg you to use them. Travel." And I love this poem because I've been there. I've been there in the sense when my brother was killed, I was furious. I was so mad. I was so angry. Vengeance was the only thing in my mind. And my brother wasn't killed fighting. He was killed being beat up by Israeli soldiers in prison. So for suspicion of throwing rocks, not for military attacks, not for shooting a gun, none of that. And I lived 8 years with that anger, that bitterness, that hatred of what do you do when somebody kills your brother? You hate, you get angry. That's how I felt. It was the only choice. I was 10 years old when he was killed. And it took me 8 years to eventually realize seeking vengeance makes you bitter and empty. And even if you were to succeed, I don't think it ever gives you any satisfaction. I don't believe it does. It took me 8 years, but eventually, as I transitioned into understanding that no, Israelis, Jews are not my enemy. They can be my allies as well, and they have been in many situations in my life. Personally and for Palestine as well, it completely changed my life. And I'm a much better person knowing that today. Much better person. I feel much better. I'm not as empty and bitter. This is not what motivates me. The anger is still there. The rage in some way is still there. But as one of my friends usually says, that rage can be like a nuclear power. You can use it to bomb and kill and hurt, or you can use it to generate electricity. The anger is there. It's a lot of fuel. You choose how to use it. And Palestinians in Gaza have a lot of rage, a lot of anger. I think there's other ways to channel it. And just like I learned to channel mine, I hope many more do, and Israelis and Palestinians. And I see people, you have other Palestinians and other Israelis doing it. A person like Abu Laish, who lost his kids in Gaza, he's ended up writing a book about it.
He lives in Toronto, actually, doesn't he? He's a doctor, yeah.
He's a doctor in Canada.
Yeah.
And he came out the day after saying, I've lost my kids, my daughters, and I'm speaking against vengeance. I'm speaking against hatred. These people exist. This week, people who, we heard from a brother of Chaim, one of the people who were killed, and he said, I don't want you to use my brother's death to bomb Gaza. I don't want you to use our story to justify killing people. Yeah. Those stories are similar to mine. I'll be honest. Unfortunately, those are not stories you will see on mainstream media, because those stories will demolish the arguments for hate, the arguments for dehumanization of either side. And therefore, you will not see a Palestinian who says, even in the worst times of the occupation, I do not justify killing people. And you will not see an Israeli who just lost his brother being, even in my darkest time, losing my brother, I do not justify killing people.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the other argument that's being made that justifies in the mind of the speaker a bit what's about to happen in Gaza. And that is that, Hamas is using the Palestinian civilians as human shields, as if that is kind of a get out of jail free card for a war crime. I don't understand how it justifies it, but explain to me what is the truth of that, and how do you counter that as a reason to actually attack civilian places?
I don't know what's the truth to that. To be honest, I've looked into it. I've done some research, and I have a hard time determining how truthful that claim is. I think, like many things, it's partially probably true. I've seen some human rights reports that says at times it did happen and at times it did not happen. It was not justified. It was not true justification for bombings. These reports that usually come out of these wars that nobody reads did condemn Hamas for their actions and how they put civilians sometimes at risk, but also have criticized Israel of using this human shield argument when it wasn't truthful and it wasn't accurate. So I think I can say this. I don't trust the militaries when they are at war. I don't trust the Israeli military messaging when they are at war, and I don't trust Hamas when they are at war. Yeah. These are, because it's war. People will lie when they're at war, and obviously no one wants, for Israel, this looks really bad. So many civilians, we talk about so far 740, 750 kids killed. Yeah. This is, just so you put into perspective, you look at other wars that happened the last few years, and these numbers are higher than wars that have lasted longer. It is devastating numbers. It is not, things happen in war. It's also pre-proportionate to the number almost of the population, which means it seems to suggest some kind of indiscriminate bombing where everyone is getting hurt. I would even go beyond maybe and say, I have a hard time trusting right now the Israeli intelligence, and Israeli intelligence that has failed miserably last week when Hamas was able to breach Israel's the fence that separate Gaza from the south communities in Israel. That was a major breach and a major failure of Israeli intelligence. So do I really trust that they can pinpoint all these Hamas leaders and they know exactly where everybody lives? I am not so confident. Also, if it is, We saw on TV whole neighborhoods being cleared out, not a house, not one building, whole neighborhoods. We talking about full squares being taken out, full blocks being taken out.
Yeah.
That seems to be less like, oh, well, Hamas leader was living, or there was a unit of Hamas there. It's a whole neighborhood. It's not one building even or two. So I have a lot of skepticism. And I think regardless, even if Hamas does use people as a human shields, it is still a responsibility in war that you try to minimize significantly the number of civilians killed. Right now, if we look at the number of civilians killed versus the number of Hamas people that are killed, you don't see any minimization.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I heard you say this in an interview the other day, and I didn't even I've been to the West Bank, but not Gaza. But you said that most Palestinians in Gaza have never met a Jewish person. Is that what you said in my quote? Is that true? Like, how does that even work? How does that happen?
I would say probably 90-80% of people in Gaza, I'm being conservative in my estimates here. Look, I haven't been able to go to Gaza since I was a kid. If I haven't been able, I meet Gazans usually online, out of the country, things like that.
Why can't you go back? Sorry, Aziz, why can't?
Because to go to Gaza, you need a permit from, if you live in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Israel. If you want to go to Gaza, you need a permit from the Israeli government. I've applied for that permit before and was rejected. Even when I was doing media work, I've tried to go and film in Gaza, and I was not allowed, even for journalism work. No Israeli has been in Gaza unless they are soldiers in decades. There were only 20,000 Palestinians given permits in Gaza to work in Israel, 20,000. Those are, I believe, the only people who have any encounter with Israelis. There is zero connection between people in Gaza and people in Israel. And yeah, you're right. We don't talk about it, but that's, again, how hatred is created. You cut any contact. You don't know who the person is. You don't know where they come from. You don't know what they like, what they hate. And for many people in Gaza, they see all Israelis as soldiers. They see all Israelis as the enemy. And for many people in Israel, they see all people in Gaza as Hamas. All people in Gaza are firing rockets and shooting in Israel. And if there is one thing that the radical right in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu groups, have succeeded at, is make us disconnect completely from each other, make us unable to have conversation, not just in Gaza, also in the West Bank. I try to change that for my family. I have Israeli friends and I invite them to my house, but majority of kids in Palestine don't have the only image of an Israeli they know is a soldier, is somebody with a gun. And even if that soldier is nice to them at the checkpoint, still carrying a gun. You don't have a normal conversation with somebody carrying a gun, and vice versa. I go and speak in Israeli schools sometimes. And when I ask students there if they've ever met a Palestinian before, it's always no, not even a Palestinian, if they ever met an Arab before. Remember, Israel has 20% of its population are Arab, are Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. And the answer is usually no. This is within Israel, without even the checkpoints. We don't have any interaction. Schools are segregated. Arabs have their own schools. Jews who are religious have their own schools. Jews who are half religious have their own school. The traditional Jews who are secular have their own schools. And so we live in such a segregated reality that makes it so easy for us to hate each other. And that's the biggest victory, I think, Netanyahu and his group have had by dividing us in a way that makes my work so much. You know how hard it is when I want to bring a group of Israelis and Palestinians, even from the West Bank, to me? You need to ask for permits. You need to wait. You need to call. You need to justify. And usually the day you only get the permit the night before, and often half of your group that you're trying to get is rejected. And this is what we face. Peace activists in Israel and Palestine are working against a system that wants us to not know each other and wants us to hate each other.
Wow. Very powerfully said. I'm just wondering, sort of in closing here, because this is an ancient dispute. Well, maybe not, but it's getting, people are actually saying that the Palestinians have no claim on the land. They never did. And I don't want to kind of relitigate that, except to say that when I was in the West Bank with a gentleman, Palestinian, whose villages had been demolished in 1967. I actually interviewed Yitzhak Rabin about it, who was quite interesting on it. But it happened. It was a war crime, and they built Canada Park over top of it by planting trees. He was as committed to that being his home as Jewish people are now to Israel, and it sort of doesn't matter what boundary when, except, like, in my view, that the territory for the Palestinians keeps getting kind of exponentially smaller and smaller and smaller. And I fear that what's going to happen now is that they won't have a place at all. I mean, that's my feeling. But what I'd like you to say to what I just said is, what is the connection that the Palestinian people feel about that place in the world for them? How do you explain their need to be there and see it also as their home?
You already know my love of poetry.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about what poem do I want to read for you about why we love Palestine. Look, I think we can go into history and talk about, like, I've done my DNA test and things like that. And my family has been in that land for many, many, many generations. I can trace my family from Jerusalem to, before that, Hebron, to easily at least a few hundred years, probably more.
Yeah.
But I think this argument, I usually hate this argument.
Yeah, me too. I hate it. Yeah.
Because you know what? Even if I was, you were, we are there now together. And we need to learn to live there together. Now, this land means a lot to me. It's where I grew up. It's where my ancestors, were. It's where I learned life. It's where my community is. It is part of my identity. I learned to love this place. When I'm here in the States and I see a picture of Jerusalem, I tell you, this morning, somebody, just a friend of mine, put a picture of Jerusalem. I start crying. This is my home. And I love being in the US, and it has given me so much, but still Jerusalem is my home. And I can't just let that go. Even people who are refugees and have left, 50, 60, 70 years ago. My uncle is in Jordan, became a refugee in 1967. That's still his home. He still speaks of Jerusalem like it's the most important thing on earth. But since I talked about poetry, I'll just quote our great poet again, Mahmoud Darwish. And in one of the times that were probably the hardest in our history, he wrote about why we need to not just die for Palestine, but live for Palestine. And that's what it meant for him. And he says, "And this earth, on Palestine, what makes life worth living for? April's hesitation, the aroma of bread at dawn, a woman's point of view about men, the work of Achilles, the beginning of love, grass on a stone, mothers living on a flute sigh, and the invader's fears of memories. We have on this earth what makes life living for. The final days of September, a woman keeping her apricot ripe after 40, the hour of sunlight in prison. A cloud reflecting swarm of creatures, the people's applause for those who face death with a smile, a tyrant's fear of songs. We have on this earth what makes life worth living. And this earth, the lady of earth, mother of all beginnings and ends. She was called Palestine. Her name later became Palestine. My lady because you are my lady, I deserve life. And I think this is probably his most famous poem for a reason, because it tells us what we love about our homeland. It's simple things. It's not just a history and what happened 1,000 years ago. It's the simple things of just being there, the coffee, the people, the songs, and even the identity we formed into, fighting the British and oppression and the Ottomans, by the way. That's what creates your identity.
Yeah. Let me ask you this in closing. What would you say to Jewish people who are afraid because of what happened, because they see anti-Jewish, not just anti-Israeli, but anti-Jewish things being said by mobs in the streets now? In my country, our stupid prime minister and the elected officials actually welcomed and clapped for a known Nazi. I think Jewish people are frightened, and I think they're kind of ignited a bit. And it's hard to think about poetry and beauty and peace. And those are kind of like luxury beliefs, to use a phrase, when you're scared for your very existence, and everything in the world right now is lining up to make you more afraid. What would you say to them as someone who's been working for a peaceful solution for a very long time, especially someone who's lost his brother in the situation too? What would you say to them, Aziz?
Yeah, I think fear is very powerful. Fear is real. I cannot minimize anyone's fear. I understand, as you mentioned earlier, when I see people attacking Jews for their identity and a rise of anti-Semitism in the West, I completely understand that fear. But I think we have to stick together. This is not Muslims versus Jews. This is not Palestinians versus Israelis. We have to stop that language. That's how we fight it. I have and I will continue to stand with my Jewish friends fighting anti-Semitism, because it's not only against them. I see it as against me as well. If you against my friends, you're against me. And I don't see Jews as, like I said earlier, I don't see Jews as my enemy. So how do we fight it? We fight it together. We don't fight it by being more polarized. I understand your fear, and I want to be with you in eradicating those sentiments of hatred. But I also want to say, I find that often people who hate Jews hate Muslims. It seems to be connected a lot of times. And that's why, again, we have to stick together. Look, yesterday, there was an Islamophobic attack on a little kid, 6 years old, in Chicago. A guy walked in and stabbed him 20 some times. A kid, 6 years old. And I said after, on a different day, if this guy got a different news outlet, he could have walked in and killed a 6-year-old Jewish kid. That's why we stick together. That's why we make sure people don't use our conflict in Israel-Palestine to rally hate against Muslims or against Jews. We can't allow this division between us. If somebody is going after the Jewish community in my city, in my country, here in the States, I am with them. This is my fight. And if somebody is going against the Muslim community, the Arab community in the States, I know that many of my Jewish friends will be standing there with me. That's how we stop it.
What's your fear for Gaza? Will it survive this? I mean, will it be a Palestinian neighborhood, so to speak, if I can put it that way, in 3 months from now? Or do you think it could be over, that they could be?
I'm very fearful. I'm very, very fearful. I hear some politicians in Israel talking about occupying Gaza again, building settlements again, pushing people out to Egypt. I hope that doesn't happen. I am very fearful, but maybe if I'll end with a story that can give people a little bit of hope.
Sure.
And it's by an Israeli author named Amos Oz, and he said, if you see a building on fire, you have three options of what to do. One is to run away. And when people see the conflict in Israel and Palestine for the last 70 plus, 80, 90 years, depends when you want to say it started, many people choose to ignore it, assuming it won't affect them. Well, we know today it does affect all of us. We can't run away. We can't ignore. The second option, when you see a building on fire, you create a committee to investigate who should we blame for this fire? Who should we go after for it? The problem with that, by the time you figure out who should you blame, everybody in that building would be dead. That's what we do, whether it's on social media, let's blame this or that, or whether it's on social media is definitely a big one, or governments or so on. Let's create a committee and discuss. 75 years later, we're still killing each other as people trying to decide, should we blame the Jews or the Arabs? Who cares? And he said the third option is to get a bucket, fill it with water, and throw it in the fire. But you might say, I don't have a bucket. Then you get a cup, you fill it with water, and you throw it in the fire. But you might say, I don't have a cup. Then you get a spoon, you fill it with water, and you throw it on the fire. And the thing is, one person with a spoon maybe cannot put out a fire. One person doing what they can do to end this madness cannot do it on their own. But if each one of us, people listening, instead of sitting and saying, well, who to blame, it's not my thing. If I'm not asking to do a lot, but if each of us can figure out at least what's my spoon, and if thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of us start carry our spoons, some of us might be able to carry our buckets, some of us might be able to carry our cups, some of us might have access to better water sources. Maybe we can put an end to this conflict, and not just an end to what's happening in Gaza now, but find a way to live together.
Wow. Thanks so much, Aziz. It's hard to be a calm center in the middle of this kind of a catastrophe, and you are that. So I'm very grateful. Aziz Abu Sarah, thanks very much for doing this, and I will very likely check in with you again at some point soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye. So that was Aziz Abu Sarah. He is a Palestinian peace activist, and he runs a travel company called Mejdi Travel, which aims to get Palestinians and Israelis together so they can meet each other and know each other beyond the awful stereotypes that have infected that part of the world. I just want to say, too, I'm going to post another Substack. It'll probably be out by the time you hear this. So if you have comments, put them there. And feel free to say what you want. I don't care if you're mad at me. Maybe I've said something stupid and insensitive. I'm doing my best here. But what I'm doing is based on many, many, many years of watching these military follies happen. And they all kind of start the same way in righteousness, and they end in disaster and tragedy, right? I remember when I was working in Washington, D.C. for a peace organization founded by Vietnam veterans, one of them paralyzed by a sniper. And I was working with two reporters, Mark Benjamin, who I think was at Slate, and another chap who was working for United Press International. And I was working as a helper, sort of to help them get information about veterans. And we discovered that these kids who were coming back from Iraq with 2, 3, 4 amputated limbs or some terrible brain damage from an IED or whatever, they would bring them in to the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and I think it's in Bethesda, kind of a suburb of DC, in the middle of the night in vans with blackout windows, because they didn't want people to know yet how bad it was. And so This is going to be bad, and I have a lot of sympathy for those poor kids from the Israeli Defense Force. I saw a video today of kids going from Miami. I think we talk about this in the interview. All gung-ho, of course, to defend Israel. And this is going to be a meat grinder. And these kids, these lovely IDF kids, and the young people in Gaza, which is to say most people there, will have nightmares about this for the rest of their lives. So it's not just the bang bang people. It's what we do to young minds when we send them to war. It should not be done lightly, and it should not be done intemperately. And I feel very strongly that is what's happening now. I think we have to resist the urge and, well, I guess just be our better selves, right? Anyway, stay critical, and we'll see you.